Welcome to Jesus Changes Everything, a daily podcast dedicated to providing a fresh look at the ancient and glorious truth that Jesus not only reigns, but is busy about the business of bringing all things under subjection, that celebrates the wonder and the glory that he has been given all authority in heaven and on earth. I'm in the middle of the semester this fall teaching Introduction to Ethics at Ivy Tech Community College here in Indiana. Part of my calling in this class is to help my students learn to be more thoughtful and consistent and coherent in their ethical decision making. It's not my job to convert them to Christianity or to hand them a Christian ethic per se, but it is my job to help them be more thoughtful. And one of the ways that I do this, and this is very common in teaching ethics, is I give my students various and sundry scenarios and then ask, okay, given this scenario, what is the right thing to do? Just earlier today, we went through a scenario that I do pretty much every semester where I ask them to imagine a big stack of gold bars just suddenly appeared out of nowhere in the middle of the classroom. There is a note attached saying, this doesn't belong to anybody else. What do we do with it? Well, I'm not going to ask you to wrestle with that today. I'm going to ask you instead to imagine this scenario. I want you to imagine that you have been put in charge under the president, because the Constitution affirms that the president is the commander-in-chief of all armed forces in this nation. But underneath him, the next person down, you've been appointed to that job. That job is called Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. That is, the chiefs are the heads of the various military arms, the Navy, the Marines, the Army, etc., Air Force. And you are the one in charge of the ones who are in charge of that. They're beneath you. The head of the Army is beneath you. The head of the Marines is beneath you. The president is above you. And one of your responsibilities to the president is to give him advice and counsel. Everybody clear so far on your job and your calling. Now keep in mind that you and the president have both taken a solemn oath and vow to protect and defend the Constitution of these United States. Now, let's suppose that having been put in this position, that there has been some uncertainty and some question with respect to the election results. The man who appointed you to this post, the man who is the commander-in-chief, his supporters, or at least some of his supporters, are persuaded that he is being cheated out of his second term. And there's talk and rumors about pushback and fighting and insisting that this governor or that vice president not certify this or certify that so that this can be contested. And this is all over the news. Do you believe at this point that included in your job responsibilities, that you would even have, with respect to your job, the liberty at this point to contact your peer who serves as the head of the armed services of that country, which is the greatest security threat to this country? I don't know, say China. Do you have the freedom to contact the head of the Chinese Joint Chiefs of Staff? Do you have the freedom to do this apart from the approval of your boss, the commander-in-chief? It's a simple question. Another way to put it, this is not unfair, this is fair. Another way to put it is, can you go behind your boss's back and contact the military head of your nation's biggest enemy and let him know, oh, by the way, if things get out of control here, if things go haywire, I will let you know. I will prepare you so that you'll have a chance to prepare. If my boss decides to go to war with your country, I will let you know before anything happens. All right. Now I want you to imagine that. Those of you who keep up with the news should know that this is in fact precisely what happened. General Milley, I believe that's how you pronounce his name. General Milley is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he made such a call to his Chinese counterpart. Now, if you have a modicum of ethical sense, then I'm trusting that you can see that this is a profoundly unethical thing for you to do. This is a betrayal of your country and a betrayal of your boss. Now, you don't have to agree with me about whether or not the president is nutso. You can believe the president is nutso if you want to. And I don't need to argue the point because it doesn't matter. We do have in place the 25th Amendment, which is a mechanism which can remove a president under certain circumstances from his position of power. But what we don't have is the freedom and the liberty to act as though he's not in charge. So if you have already done what General Milley has done, now the next question is, when word gets out, what's the right thing to do? If you're a Christian, you should know this. This is not a hard question. The right thing to do is to repent. The right thing to do is to confess your wrongdoing. But here we are, months and months later. The news that this took place has gotten out. But the way the dominant media is spinning the news is this. Look what poor General Milley had to do because the president was cray-cray. That's what the Washington Post said. Oh, poor General Milley. He had to do this because he was worried that the president wasn't in his right mind and something bad would happen. So he's trying to, keep the peace across the globe. How heroic. Oh. I suppose you could argue that, the Goldbergs, when they sold nuclear secrets to the Russians, they just thought the president was crazy and needed to be, they were just trying to help avoid a world war. I suppose Benedict Arnold, he must have thought George Washington was crazy, and out of his goodness and his character, he thought it would be safer to give some information to the British for the well-being of our country. Friends, I hope you don't get tired of this. I do feel like, one of the things that I want to bring to the table with the Jesus Changes Everything podcast is to look at a story you may have heard of but say to you instead of, boy, can you believe this? Can I say to you instead, hey, have you considered it from this perspective? I don't want you to miss out not only on how wickedly the general behaved, but I want you to notice the ridiculous justification being provided by mainstream media for it. There's no shame. There's no embarrassment. All there is pointing fingers at President Trump. Again, I'm no apologist for President Trump. I am an apologist for the Constitution. You can't make up your own mind and go your own way when you have been given a position of authority under one person and over the whole of the military of this nation. That should not be a surprising take. But that's where we are. We're at a place now, friends, where you can't get... There's so many dogs wagging their tails, you can't tell what the story is. That is, you can say, oh, well, this leak on Milley, this is a distraction so we don't look at what happened in Afghanistan. Or what happened in Afghanistan is a distraction so we don't have to look at what's going on at the border. Or what's going on the border is a distraction so we don't have to think about the $3.5 trillion budget. Well, maybe so on some of those cases. But the point is, we have sunk so far away from honesty and integrity that a general, the head of the armed forces in the military, the president is the head overall, but in the military, the top military person can have secret conversations with the top military person in China and not resign, not be fired, not be removed from office, not be charged, and in fact be praised. Oh my stars. Have I told you it's getting ugly out there? This is ugliness. This is wickedness. This is wrong. And these are the people with their fingers on our nuclear arsenal. These are the people giving counsel on whether or not our sons and daughters now should be sent overseas to fight somebody. People who feel the need to call their greatest security threats military leader and say, hey, you and I, we've got an understanding, right? Capiche? You and I, we're on the same side. We're on the same team. Overt treason out in the open and zero consequences from the federal government. That's where we are. And I don't like what that says about where we're going. We come now in our ongoing series that we call The Bible in 5 Minutes to the book of 1 Timothy. And 1 Timothy, along with 2 Timothy and Titus, are grouped together under the subhead called the pastoral epistles. All three written by Paul. 1 and 2 Timothy obviously written to Timothy, and we're going to probably highlight a little bit more the relationship between Paul and Timothy when we get to 2 Timothy. But suffice it to say today that they had a deeply close, loving, familial kind of relationship, that Paul was a kind of father to Timothy. And in this particular epistle, remembering Paul's trust in Timothy to lead well in the context of the church, we have Paul's counsel to Timothy as he is dealing with particular struggles and problems in the church at Ephesus. And those particular problems and struggles are all wrapped up in issues related to false teachers and a false teaching that is in some ways ascetic ascetic, ascetic. Ascetics are people who have a sort of Gnostic approach to the created order, don't touch, don't taste, and who finds, spiritual strength or spiritual superiority in the capacity to not deal with those kinds of earthly things. So one of those things that was coming into the church, it's based on what we're reading in the letter itself, is a call from these false teachers to abstain from certain foods, and even a call to abstain from marriage. And out of these calls, and I would argue that both of these are probably in the same ilk of what we call second blessing Christianity. Second blessing Christianity looks at the people of God and the church of God as if it's made up of two kinds of people. There are the sort of lower class, barely making it in Christians, and this is, a gracious perspective from the perspective of the upper class people. And this is not, of course, financial, but there's this kind of Christian, this ordinary, worldly, barely make it in kind of Christian. And then there is the zealous, committed, faithful, good Christians. And in this second blessing notion, we're in search of that which will give us something more. And often that will sort of glom onto some teaching, often a teaching that is connected to ascetics. Well, I've given up this, I've given up that, and that shows how wonderful spiritual person I am, which should clue you into the real problem. This gives birth to an explosion of pride inside the church. Well, I've given up this, well, I've given up that. I've given up more than all of you. I've done this. I don't partake of this. I don't partake of that because I'm so very committed to Jesus. When Jesus gives you a gift, the spiritual thing is not to say no thank you. The spiritual thing is to say thank you and to receive his gifts. So Paul writes to Timothy and gives him some instruction on how to deal with this particular kind of problem. And in the midst of this, also gives us an extended discussion on the biblical qualifications or qualities that we're to look for in an elder in the church. And interesting, it's none of the doesn't do this, doesn't do that ascetic variety, but it is all issues of character. Is this a gentleman? Is this a man who's not in it for the money? Is this a man who's not given to much wine? These kinds of qualifications are, again, moral qualifications. This is front and center why and how we started the Shepherd's College, believing that the kind of training that we do for elders in the church is grounded in a series of academic benchmarks and standards that need to be thrown overboard for the sake of the biblical qualities and characteristics. So that's what we're trying to do with the Shepherd's College. We're trying to follow this pattern that Paul gives to Timothy. Now, one other thing I wanted to mention before we move on next week to 2 Timothy is this, that one of the things we see in these pastoral epistles is the connection between the gospel and our behavior. We have this notion in the contemporary church that somehow or other, if you overemphasize the gospel, you won't change people's behavior. If you overemphasize in changing people's behavior, you'll lose sight of the gospel. Well, I'm persuaded that the best thing, the most powerful thing for helping any of us grow in grace and walk in greater obedience is a deeper grasp of the gospel, not the technical process, but a internal zeal and passion to own the reality of my sin, to believe in the fullness of Christ's redemption for me, and to embrace fully the infinite and immutable love of the Father toward me. That will change us more than scoldings. So I want to argue that they both go together, and I'm going to argue that's precisely what Paul is doing here in 1 Timothy. You've been listening to the Jesus Changes Everything podcast, a production of Dunamis Fellowship, the teaching outreach of Dr. R.C. Sproul Jr. If you've enjoyed this podcast, we encourage you to subscribe, which you can do at all the usual outlets, to tell your friends, and to spread the word. To learn more about the work of Dunamis Fellowship, please visit rcsproulJR.com. And join us next time on Jesus Changes Everything.